Sometimes the most dangerous sentence a man can say is the one he laughs at while saying it. The rooftop of the Whitmore Grand Hotel glowed like a crown above Manhattan, its glass railings reflecting the golden lights of the city stretching for miles below. Waiters in black jackets moved quietly between clusters of guests, balancing silver trays filled with champagne flutes that chimed softly each time they touched. The warm summer air carried the distant sound of traffic 20 stories beneath them, but up here everything felt slower, richer, untouched by the ordinary world. At the center of it all stood Daniel Whitmore, the 35-year-old investment CEO who had built Whitmore Capital into one of the fastest-growing firms on Wall Street. His tailored charcoal suit fit him like armor, his confidence filling the space around him as easily as the music drifting from the live jazz trio near the rooftop bar. Investors leaned toward him when he spoke. Journalists waited for his smile. To most people in the room, Daniel Whitmore represented the kind of success that seemed almost mythic: private jets, luxury penthouses, headlines in financial magazines. But standing just a few steps away from him, near the quiet edge of the rooftop where the city lights shimmered against the dark Hudson River, was someone who did not belong to that world at all. Aaliyah Carter wore a simple navy dress and a pair of low heels that had carried her through a 12-hour hospital shift earlier that day. She worked as a nurse at a community clinic in Queens, a place where the fluorescent lights never felt glamorous and the coffee was always lukewarm. Yet tonight she stood among millionaires and venture capitalists because, months earlier, she had crossed paths with Daniel Whitmore in a moment that had felt almost accidental. Two lives intersecting in the brief quiet of a hospital hallway when his injured cousin had been admitted after a minor car accident. They had talked. Then they had talked again. And for a short while, something fragile and hopeful had grown between them. But tonight that fragile hope was about to shatter. Daniel had been drinking champagne with a group of business partners when someone asked him about the woman standing nearby. One of the men chuckled and said, "So Daniel, who's the mystery guest?" The question hung in the warm rooftop air like a spotlight. Daniel glanced over at Aaliyah, and for a moment she believed he might introduce her kindly, maybe even proudly. Instead he laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh at first, just the casual sound of someone used to being admired. But then he said the words that would echo through the next 5 years of both their lives. "Relax," he said with a careless grin, lifting his glass slightly. "I'm a millionaire CEO." His eyes flicked briefly toward Aaliyah before returning to his friends. "She's nobody." The laughter from the group came quickly, the kind of polite laughter wealthy men give each other when they assume everyone understands the same rules of the game. But Aaliyah didn't laugh. The music continued playing behind them, a slow trumpet melody rising into the warm night sky. Yet for her the rooftop suddenly felt colder than the hospital corridors she worked in every day. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she simply looked at Daniel Whitmore, as if memorizing the man who had just revealed who he truly was. The golden lights of Manhattan reflected in her dark eyes for one silent second longer, and then she turned and walked toward the elevator without saying a single word. Daniel barely noticed her leaving. To him, it was just another party, another passing conversation in a life filled with meetings, investors, and headlines. What he didn't know, what no one on that rooftop knew, was that the quiet woman walking away from the glittering skyline carried a secret that would change everything. And 5 years later, when Daniel Whitmore would see her again, standing calmly in a crowded room with 3 small children beside her, he would finally understand that the person he once called nobody had been the most important person in the room all along. 2 weeks passed after the night on the rooftop, but the sound of Daniel Whitmore's laughter still echoed in Aaliyah Carter's memory every time the city grew quiet. Life in Queens did not slow down for broken pride or wounded feelings. The alarm clock in her small apartment rang at 5:30 every morning, long before the sun painted the skyline pink above the East River. By 6:30, she was already walking through the sliding glass doors of the community clinic where she worked, the smell of antiseptic and fresh coffee greeting her like an old routine that never changed. Children with fevers sat beside tired parents in the waiting room. Elderly patients filled out insurance forms with careful handwriting. Aaliyah moved through the hallways with steady calm, the same quiet strength that had carried her through years of nursing school and double shifts. Yet something inside her felt different now. At first she blamed exhaustion. Long hours could make anyone feel strange. But as the days passed, she noticed small changes that did not disappear with sleep. One morning, after finishing a routine checkup with a patient, she stepped into the clinic restroom and stared at her reflection beneath the soft fluorescent lights. Her eyes looked the same. Her expression was still composed. But there was a quiet uncertainty in the way she held the edge of the sink. That afternoon, on her way home, she stopped at a small pharmacy on the corner of Northern Boulevard. The store was quiet except for the hum of refrigerators near the back wall. She walked slowly through the aisles until she found what she needed and placed the small white box on the counter. The cashier barely looked up as he rang it up. 20 minutes later, she was back in her apartment, the late afternoon sunlight spilling through the narrow kitchen window and stretching across the worn wooden table. The city outside sounded distant, like a radio playing in another room. Aaliyah followed the instructions on the box carefully, her hands calm even though her heart beat faster than usual. Then she waited. 30 seconds can feel very long when someone is standing alone with their future quietly forming in front of them. When the result appeared, she stared at it for a long moment, as if reading a language she had not expected to see written in her life. 2 clear lines. The apartment was completely silent. No music, no voices, only the faint sound of a passing subway train somewhere beneath the streets of Queens. Aaliyah slowly lowered herself into the kitchen chair and placed one hand against her stomach, not out of fear, but out of disbelief at how quickly life can change direction. Daniel Whitmore did not know about this moment. He was likely inside a glass office tower in Midtown Manhattan, discussing investment strategies with men in tailored suits, surrounded by numbers and contracts and decisions that shaped entire companies. In his world, that rooftop conversation had already disappeared into the long list of parties and meetings that filled his calendar. But here, in a small apartment filled with warm evening light, that careless sentence he once laughed while saying had quietly set another story into motion. Aaliyah Carter looked once more at the small test resting on the table and exhaled slowly. She did not cry. She did not reach for her phone. Instead, she sat in thoughtful silence, realizing that the next chapter of her life had just begun, and Daniel Whitmore had no idea that somewhere in New York City, a future he had never imagined was already growing. The following week felt like walking through fog for Aaliyah Carter, not because her life had stopped, but because something invisible had begun quietly shaping every decision she made. Morning trains still rattled beneath Queens. The clinic doors still opened at the same hour. Patients still filled the waiting room with tired smiles and insurance forms. But now, every moment carried a quiet awareness that she was no longer moving through the world alone. One Thursday afternoon, after finishing her shift, Aaliyah sat inside a small examination room at a women's health center a few miles from the clinic where she worked. The office smelled faintly of disinfectant and lavender air freshener, a calm scent meant to ease nerves. Outside the closed door, she could hear soft footsteps in the hallway and the distant hum of a printer. The nurse who had checked her blood pressure earlier had been kind, speaking with the gentle patience of someone who had guided many women through similar moments. Aaliyah sat on the examination table with her hands folded quietly in her lap, her posture steady even though her thoughts moved in many directions at once. When the doctor entered the room, she greeted Aaliyah with a warm smile and began explaining the routine steps of the appointment. The ultrasound machine stood beside the examination bed, its screen dark for the moment, waiting to reveal what no one could yet see. A few minutes later, the room grew very quiet except for the soft electronic sound of the machine powering on. The doctor studied the screen carefully, her expression focused as she moved the device gently and watched the image shift into clarity. At first she said nothing, and Aaliyah wondered if something was wrong. Then the doctor's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise before she turned the screen toward her patient. Her voice carried a mixture of calm professionalism and genuine amazement when she spoke. She said that sometimes life brings unexpected blessings in more than one form. Then she explained what the image revealed. Aaliyah was not expecting one baby. She was expecting 3. The doctor pointed to the small shapes visible on the monitor, each one moving slightly, each one carrying its own tiny heartbeat. The rhythmic sounds filled the quiet examination room like the soft tapping of distant drums. For a moment Aaliyah forgot to breathe. 3 heartbeats. three separate lives forming at the same time, each one depending entirely on the choices she would make from this moment forward. The news might have frightened someone else, but Aaliyah Carter had spent years caring for people who faced challenges far greater than uncertainty. She looked at the glowing shapes on the screen and slowly placed her hand over her stomach again, this time with a new understanding of what her future would require. The doctor asked if she would like to notify the father, explaining that support systems were important during pregnancy. Aaliyah listened politely, but her mind drifted briefly back to the rooftop lights of Manhattan and the sound of a man laughing while calling her nobody. She imagined the towering glass buildings of Midtown, where Daniel Whitmore probably sat at that exact moment, discussing investments and corporate strategies, completely unaware that three small heartbeats were quietly rewriting the story of his life. Aaliyah did not reach for her phone. She did not ask the doctor to write down a number. Instead, she gave a calm smile and said that she would handle everything herself. As she left the clinic later that evening, the sky above New York had turned a deep shade of blue, and the first city lights flickered on along the streets. Cars moved steadily through traffic. People hurried home from work. The world continued exactly as it always had. But inside Aaliyah Carter, three tiny heartbeats moved in quiet rhythm, and with each step she took down the sidewalk, she understood that the path ahead would not be easy. Still, she walked forward with the same quiet dignity she had carried the night she left that rooftop party, knowing that sometimes the strongest stories begin when someone chooses to build a life without asking anyone for permission. Autumn arrived quietly in Queens the year Aaliyah Carter became a mother, the air turning cooler as golden leaves began collecting along the sidewalks outside her apartment building. Life moved forward not with dramatic announcements, but with the steady rhythm of responsibility. Months earlier, the ultrasound screen had revealed three tiny heartbeats, and now those heartbeats had become three small boys whose cries, laughter, and curious eyes filled the once quiet apartment with constant life. The first months were the hardest. Sleep came in short fragments between feedings and diaper changes. The small living room slowly transformed into a world of baby blankets, bottles warming on the kitchen counter, and soft lullabies playing through a small speaker near the window. Aaliyah learned quickly that raising one child required strength, but raising three demanded something even deeper than strength. It required patience measured in endless moments and a calm determination that refused to break even on the longest nights. Yet there were also quiet miracles hidden inside the exhaustion. The first time all three babies fell asleep at the same time felt like a rare gift from the universe. The first time they opened their eyes and focused on her face made the long nights feel worthwhile. As the seasons passed, the boys grew stronger. Their small hands learned to reach for toys scattered across the living room floor. Their laughter filled the apartment in a way that made even the aging walls seem warmer. Aaliyah gave them names that carried hope into their futures. The oldest by a few minutes was named Noah, calm and thoughtful even as a baby. The second was named Elijah, whose bright eyes seemed constantly curious about the world. The youngest was named Isaiah, whose laughter often arrived first whenever something delighted them. Three brothers who shared the same birthday, the same small apartment, and the same mother who worked tirelessly to give them a life built on dignity rather than resentment. Every morning began before sunrise. Aaliyah prepared bottles, dressed three small boys, and sometimes carried two at once while the third held onto the edge of her jacket with tiny, determined fingers. Daycare expenses forced her to take additional shifts at the clinic, and many evenings ended with her studying medical textbooks after the children finally slept, determined to earn her advanced nursing certification so that she could provide even more stability for their future. Through all of this, Daniel Whitmore remained completely unaware that three young lives had entered the world carrying echoes of his own features. In Midtown Manhattan, his career continued climbing higher each year. His investment firm expanded into new markets. Financial magazines placed his photograph on glossy covers beside headlines praising his ambition and vision. To the outside world, Daniel Whitmore represented success in its most polished form. But several miles away, inside a modest apartment where three small beds stood side by side in a carefully arranged bedroom, another kind of success was quietly unfolding every day. Aaliyah Carter never spoke bitterly about the past. When friends occasionally asked about the father of the boys, She simply smiled gently and said that what mattered most was the life they were building now. The children grew surrounded by love, discipline, and the quiet example of a mother who refused to let someone else's careless words define her future. Years passed this way, each one adding new milestones. First steps across the living room carpet. First words spoken in excited unison. First small backpacks carried proudly on their shoulders as they prepared to begin preschool. By the time the boys reached their 5th birthday, the world had begun to notice something remarkable about them. It appeared in the shape of their smiles, the color of their eyes, and the unmistakable structure of their faces that seemed oddly familiar to anyone who had ever seen a photograph of a certain well-known investment CEO. But Aaliyah Carter did not build her life around recognition or revenge. She simply continued forward, guiding 3 growing boys with patience and quiet strength, unaware that destiny was slowly arranging a moment when the past and the present would finally stand face to face. 5 years can pass quietly when someone is focused on building a life instead of looking back, and for Aaliyah Carter those years had unfolded one determined day at a time. By the time Noah, Elijah, and Isaiah turned 5 years old, the small apartment in Queens felt less like a temporary shelter and more like the center of a carefully built world. Mornings were filled with the cheerful chaos of 3 energetic boys preparing for preschool. Small sneakers lined up near the door, tiny jackets hanging from hooks. Along the wall, the kitchen table often held 3 bowls of cereal and 3 voices speaking at once as the brothers told their mother about dreams they barely remembered or cartoons they hoped to watch later. Aaliyah had grown stronger in ways that could not be measured by any ordinary scale. She had completed her advanced nursing certification after years of studying late at night while the boys slept. The clinic where she once worked as a junior nurse now trusted her with greater responsibilities, and her colleagues respected the quiet discipline she carried into every shift. Yet the greatest success in her life stood right beside her each morning, holding her hands as they walked toward the subway station together. Noah often walked slightly ahead, thoughtful and observant, already asking questions about buildings and trains and the way the city seemed to wake up around them. Elijah was curious about everything, pointing at buses and street signs as if each discovery was the most important event of the day. Isaiah laughed easily, sometimes spinning in circles on the sidewalk until his brothers reminded him they were supposed to keep moving. The 3 boys shared the same warm brown skin as their mother, but their eyes held a lighter color that caught attention whenever sunlight reflected across their faces. Strangers occasionally paused when they saw them together, not because of anything unusual about children laughing on a city sidewalk, but because something about the boys looked strangely familiar. Aaliyah noticed those moments, but never gave them power over her thoughts. Her focus remained simple and clear. She wanted her sons to grow into good men who understood respect, humility, and kindness. Meanwhile, several miles away across the East River, Daniel Whitmore's life continued moving through a very different rhythm. His company had expanded into international markets, and his name appeared frequently in financial news. Glass office towers reflected his success across the skyline of Midtown Manhattan. Investors praised his strategy. Business magazines described him as one of the most influential young executives in the country. His calendar remained full of meetings, interviews, and high-profile charity events that reinforced the image of a man who had everything under control. One of those events approached on a cool evening in early spring. The Whitmore Foundation had organized a large charity gala supporting educational programs for children in underserved communities. The ballroom, chosen for the event, was located inside a historic Manhattan hotel known for its high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and sweeping marble staircases that seemed designed for moments of elegance. Invitations had been sent across the city to business leaders, philanthropists, journalists, and community workers whose efforts supported youth education. Among those invitations was one addressed to a nurse named Aaliyah Carter, whose dedication to community health programs had recently gained recognition from several nonprofit organizations. When the envelope arrived in her mailbox, she almost assumed it had been delivered to the wrong apartment. Yet the letter inside clearly thanked her for her work helping families in Queens and invited her to attend the evening as an honored guest. Aaliyah read the letter carefully while her 3 sons colored pictures at the kitchen table nearby. She had no way of knowing that the same event had been personally organized by the man who once laughed under golden rooftop lights and called her nobody. The night of the gala would bring many successful people into the same elegant room. Music would fill the ballroom. Conversations would echo beneath the chandeliers. And somewhere in that crowded space, two lives that had quietly traveled separate paths for 5 years were about to cross again in a moment neither of them could fully imagine. The evening of the charity gala arrived with the quiet elegance that only Manhattan seemed to master, the kind of night when the city lights reflected against polished glass towers, and the air carried a soft spring warmth that made people linger outside before stepping into bright ballrooms. Inside the historic hotel hosting the Whitmore Foundation event, crystal chandeliers hung high above a vast marble floor, scattering warm golden light across hundreds of guests who moved through the room in tailored suits and evening dresses. Waiters carried silver trays between conversations, offering sparkling water and small appetizers while a string quartet played gentle music near the staircase that curved toward the upper balcony. At the center of the gathering stood Daniel Whitmore, greeting donors and shaking hands with investors who praised the foundation's growing reputation. To most of the guests, he looked exactly as he always had in the magazines and interviews that described his rise in the financial world. His posture was confident, his voice calm, and his presence commanded the kind of attention that successful men often carried without effort. Yet even Daniel could not control everything unfolding inside that ballroom. Across the room, near the entrance where newly arriving guests paused to take in the atmosphere, Aaliyah Carter stepped quietly inside, holding the hands of 3 young boys who looked around with wide curiosity at the sparkling chandeliers above them. The invitation had explained that families were welcome, and Aaliyah had decided that her sons should see the kind of event where people gathered to support education and community programs. Noah walked slightly ahead, his thoughtful eyes scanning the enormous room with careful interest. Elijah studied the musicians with fascination as the soft notes of the violin drifted through the air. Isaiah stared upward at the lights, whispering that the ceiling looked like a sky made of stars. Aaliyah wore a simple but elegant dark blue dress that reflected her calm confidence. She did not step into the ballroom with hesitation or pride. She entered the same way she walked into every room in her life, quietly and with dignity that did not ask for attention. A volunteer greeted her at the door and thanked her for attending, guiding her toward a table near the front where several community leaders had already gathered. The boys followed closely beside her, their small dress shoes tapping softly against the marble floor. For a few minutes the evening continued normally. Guests chatted about education programs and upcoming charity initiatives. Photographers moved through the crowd, capturing moments of generosity and celebration. Daniel Whitmore stood near the stage speaking with a group of investors about the foundation's plans for expanding scholarship opportunities across the country. Then something small interrupted the smooth rhythm of the evening. A young boy's voice carried clearly across the quiet pause between musical notes. It was Isaiah, pointing toward the large glass windows that overlooked the city skyline, and excitedly telling his brothers that he could see the lights of a bridge in the distance. Daniel turned his head slightly at the sound of the child's voice. It was not the words that caught his attention, but the tone, the bright energy of a young voice echoing in a room usually filled with adult conversations. His eyes moved casually across the crowd toward the source of the sound. At first he saw only 3 small boys standing beside a woman in a blue dress. But then one of the boys turned his face toward the lights spilling from the chandelier above, and Daniel Whitmore felt something strange settle into his chest. The shape of the boy's jaw looked familiar. The color of his eyes caught the light in a way Daniel had seen before in a mirror every morning. For a brief second the noise of the ballroom faded into the background as his attention fixed on the 3 children standing only 30 feet away. Noah turned next, his calm expression revealing the same unmistakable features. Then Elijah laughed at something his brother said, and the sound of that laughter sent a quiet shock through Daniel's thoughts, because suddenly the resemblance was impossible to ignore. 3 young boys stood across the ballroom with faces that looked startlingly like his own childhood photographs, and beside them stood a woman Daniel Whitmore had not seen in 5 years. For several seconds Daniel Whitmore did not move. The ballroom continued its elegant rhythm around him as glasses clinked and soft music drifted beneath the chandeliers. Yet his attention remained fixed on the three small boys standing across the room beside a woman he had not seen in half a decade. At first he wondered if his mind was simply playing a strange trick on him. The human brain often searches for familiar patterns even where none exist. But the longer he looked, the more impossible it became to dismiss what he was seeing. The oldest boy, Noah, stood with a calm posture that looked almost identical to the way Daniel himself often stood during business meetings, shoulders relaxed yet observant, eyes quietly studying everything around him. Elijah's bright expression carried the same slightly curved smile Daniel had seen in photographs from his own childhood. And Isaiah, who had been laughing moments earlier while pointing at the skyline outside the windows, had eyes the same pale gray blue that Daniel had inherited from his father. 3 children. 3 unmistakable reflections staring back at him from across the ballroom. Daniel felt an unfamiliar tension settle into his chest, the kind of quiet shock that arrives when the past suddenly walks back into the present without warning. He had spent years controlling every aspect of his life with careful planning and calculated decisions. Yet this moment felt completely outside the boundaries of anything he could predict. Across the room, Aaliyah Carter noticed him looking. She had recognized him the moment she entered the ballroom earlier that evening, though she had not expected him to notice her so quickly. 5 years had changed both of them in ways that could not be measured only by time. Daniel Whitmore still carried the polished confidence of a powerful executive, but Aaliyah now stood with the calm strength of someone who had built an entire life through quiet resilience. When their eyes met across the room, neither of them spoke. The distance between them felt larger than the length of the ballroom floor, filled with memories neither of them had forgotten. The boys remained unaware of the tension unfolding around them. Noah tugged gently on his mother's hand and asked if they could look at the dessert table he had spotted near the back wall. Elijah pointed toward the musicians again, fascinated by the shining surface of the violin beneath the chandelier light. Isaiah looked up at Aaliyah with bright curiosity and asked who the tall man was who kept staring at them. The simple question hung softly in the air between them. Aaliyah followed her son's gaze for a moment before answering calmly. She did not show anger or bitterness. Her voice remained steady, shaped by the same quiet dignity that had guided her through every challenge of the past 5 years. She told Isaiah that the man across the room was someone she had known a long time ago. The boy nodded as if that explanation was enough and returned his attention to his brothers. But Daniel had already begun walking toward them. Each step felt strangely heavy despite the polished marble floor beneath his shoes. Conversations faded into the background as several guests noticed the direction he was heading, curious about what had suddenly captured the attention of the evening's host. When he finally stopped a few feet away from Aaliyah and the 3 boys, the resemblance became even clearer under the warm glow of the chandelier light. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but found that the words he had rehearsed for business negotiations and press interviews did not come easily now. Instead, he simply looked at the 3 children standing beside the woman he once dismissed with a careless laugh. And in that quiet moment, Daniel Whitmore realized that the past he believed had disappeared had been quietly growing into something far greater than he ever imagined. The distance between them was only a few feet now, yet the silence felt deeper than any crowded ballroom could explain. Daniel Whitmore stood facing Aaliyah Carter and the 3 boys, his thoughts moving faster than the conversations and music surrounding them. For years he had controlled billion-dollar negotiations with calm precision, but at this moment none of those skills seemed useful, because the truth standing in front of him did not come from contracts or numbers. It came from 3 small faces that looked unmistakably familiar. Noah was the first to speak. The boy looked up at Daniel with quiet curiosity, studying him the way children naturally observe strangers. His voice was polite but direct when he asked if Daniel was the man who organized the big event. Several nearby guests glanced toward them, recognizing the host of the evening standing unusually still beside a small family. Daniel nodded slowly, his voice careful as he answered that he was responsible for the foundation. Elijah stepped a little closer to his brother, his bright eyes examining Daniel with open curiosity. Children rarely understood the complicated emotions adults carried, and to Elijah this moment simply felt like meeting someone important at a large celebration. Isaiah, still holding his mother's hand, tilted his head slightly and looked between Daniel and Aaliyah as if trying to solve a small puzzle. The resemblance between the boys and Daniel was even clearer at this distance. The same shape of their eyebrows, the same pale gray-blue eyes that reflected the chandelier light, the same small expressions that appeared when they looked thoughtful or amused. Daniel felt the weight of realization pressing quietly against his thoughts. 5 years ago, he had believed that night on the rooftop had ended a brief and unimportant chapter of his life. Yet here, standing in a room filled with hundreds of people, the consequences of that moment were suddenly alive and breathing in front of him. Aaliyah watched him carefully, not with anger but with the calm composure of someone who had already lived through the hardest parts of the story. Her voice carried a gentle steadiness when she finally spoke. She introduced the boys by name, first Noah, then Elijah, then Isaiah. Each child offered a small polite greeting, the kind taught by a mother who valued respect more than pride. Daniel listened to their names and felt something shift quietly inside him. For the first time in many years, he was not thinking about investors, headlines, or corporate strategy. He was looking at 3 young lives that existed because of a moment he once treated carelessly. The string quartet continued playing nearby, their music soft and elegant beneath the high ceiling, yet Daniel barely heard it. His attention remained fixed on Aaliyah as he asked the question forming slowly in his mind. His voice was lower now, stripped of the confident tone that usually filled his conversations. He asked how long she had known. Aaliyah understood what he meant without needing further explanation. She glanced briefly at her sons before answering with quiet honesty that she had learned shortly after the night they last saw each other. Daniel absorbed the words slowly. 5 years. 5 years of birthdays, first steps, first words, and everyday moments he had never even known existed. Noah looked up again and asked his mother if they could still visit the dessert table she promised earlier. Aaliyah smiled softly and told the boys they could go look as long as they stayed within sight. The 3 brothers walked together toward the nearby table, their small voices filled with excitement about chocolate cake and fruit tarts. As they moved away, Daniel and Aaliyah remained standing beneath the chandelier light, the distance between them now filled not with silence, but with the quiet truth both of them finally understood. And in that moment, Daniel Whitmore realized that the woman he once dismissed with a careless sentence had built something far greater than wealth or reputation. She had built a family that carried his reflection in 3 living smiles.